In this video, I'll do an overview of vulnerability scanning. Vulnerability scanning begins with identification of assets that have value to the organization. That could be in the form of sensitive data, or specific business processes, or certain ingredients used to come up with a magic mixture in the food industry, and so on. After the assets have been identified, they then need to be prioritized along with the likelihood of threats against those assets. We also have to weigh in what the organization's appetite for risk is. Next, we can actually conduct a vulnerability assessment. This might be conducted by internal IT staff or IT techies from a third-party firm, or it could also be conducted by a malicious black hat user that's performing reconnaissance scans. What should be scanned with a vulnerability scanning session? Well, it depends on what it is you want to test for weaknesses. To identify weaknesses, you might be interested in scanning the entire network. You might scan a single device on the network or all devices on the network. Maybe only certain types of devices have your interest. Maybe systems that are running Windows operating systems are the only things you want to look for weaknesses on. You might also scan applications looking for vulnerabilities. So all applications or specific applications. So when we start configuring our vulnerability scan, we configure the scope. And that scope might be an entire network, a specific subnet, an IP address range, and so on. Here I've got a trial version of GFI LandGuard 2014. And here under the scan area, I have the option of determining my scan target, which defaults to localhost. Now, if I go ahead and click on the ellipsis button over on the right, that's the button with the 3 dots, here I can add a rule for computers that must meet certain conditions in order for them to be scanned. So it could be based on computer names. I could maybe import a file that has computer names in it, or a specific domain name for Active Directory, an IP address range, even an organizational unit within Active Directory. So the idea is that we can give it a scope of what it is we want to scan. Other considerations when configuring the scan settings are whether or not you're going to conduct a credentialed or a non-credentialed scan. So this means that we either give it credentials. So for example, perhaps we want to use the administrative credentials or the root credentials and try to look for weaknesses, or we might want to mimic an attacker that really doesn't know anything about the environment, and we might want to conduct a non-credentialed scan. We can also run a manual or a scheduled scan. Ideally, you should have scans scheduled to run automatically on a periodic basis because threats are ever-changing. And so if we only conduct a vulnerability assessment scan once per quarter, once per year, we might miss out on threats that are actually infiltrating our network. When you're configuring a vulnerability scan, you'll always have an option where you can specify a specific set of credentials that you want to use to conduct the scan. Of course, you could also not specify any credentials. You could conduct, in this case, a null session scan. But at the same time, if I were to go in this specific tool under the configuration menu, over on the left, I'd see that I could also configure scheduled scans so that we're keeping up to date with any weaknesses that might have not been apparent before, but things change. So running these scans periodically is always a very important consideration. Scans can be run on the server, where the server reaches out on its own and discovers devices on the network and how they're configured and applications and so on. And depending on whether you run a credentialed versus non-credentialed scan will determine how in-depth the returned information really is. There's also agent-based scanning, where we must install a software agent on given devices on the network that can provide more scan information. Or we might install agents on machines on the edge of a network that our current existing server-based scanning can't reach. Most vulnerability scanners will have some kind of auto-remediation capabilities, even if it's simply turning off options that are deemed insecure or applying updates that are missing. The results of a scan will identify weaknesses but will not exploit them, like a penetration test would. So there's not as much risk for disruption of production systems when you conduct a vulnerability scan as there would be when you would conduct a penetration test. So the results also allow us to improve or replace existing security controls. So as we've seen, a vulnerability scan then is non-invasive. Discovered vulnerabilities are not exploited like they are with pen tests. We should enable scheduled continuous monitoring of critical IT systems in terms of for their availability, for malware infections, even things like denial of service attacks. And that starts to fall into that gray area of getting into intrusion detection and prevention systems. The items that would be checked in a standard vulnerability scan would include things like open ports, which tells us what services are viewable or reachable on the host, any malware that might have been detected, missing service packs, default operating system and app configurations that could present security vulnerabilities, as well as insecure configurations. Also, we might configure compliance with pre-configured security baselines. So for example, here we've got a scan that's been conducted on a host running Windows Server 2012 R264-bit, and we can see there are a few high security vulnerabilities. And if we click them, and then over on the right, expand the categories for miscellaneous, we see that auto run is enabled. That's a security risk. Under software, we've also got some information here talking about a router or firewall configuration allowing source routing packets. And then we can take a look at other vulnerabilities that are listed here. Here they're classified as low security vulnerabilities or high. And then there's potential vulnerabilities, missing service packs. So all of these things are normally configurable when we scan for weaknesses, either on a network, on a device, for an app, and so on. Whichever tool you happen to use for vulnerability scanning, it's always important to make sure it's got an up-to-date vulnerability scanning database so it knows what to look for. Common vulnerability scanning tools include OpenVAS, Nessus, Microsoft Baseline Security Analyzer, Nexpose, and Qualys FreeScan. In this video, we did an overview of vulnerability scanning.